Hello, fellow web slingers and merry Marvelites. This is your buddy Aidan. I've recently done a series of digital speed paintings of the classic Spider-Man villains, and I figured, well, now's as good of a time as any to talk about what The Amazing Spider-Man by Steve Ditko and Stan Lee meant to me. So I was a kid in the 90s, and the 90s was a very bad time to be a comic book reader if you were, just a kid looking for a good, simple adventure to read, because number one, comic book companies, the major ones, were always in the middle of some massive crossover, mega promotional event, Infinity Ultimate Crisis on Infinite Earths and crap like that, where you would have a single storyline that stretched out to over a year and was continued over multiple titles that the company produced. So it was nearly impossible to just pick up an issue of anything, X-Men, Avengers, and just be able to sit down and read a solid story from beginning to end. You were just completely lost unless if you were picking up all of these titles every single month, which I was not. So I very rarely had any idea what the hell was going on in them. Number two, the 90s was a very testosterone-soaked era for comic books, where you had all of the gritted teeth and the big veins and the big guns and all this stuff, where you kind of get the feeling a lot of comic book artists thought that the size of their dicks were measured by how much of a badass their comic book characters were. And if you were an outcast kid like me who got beaten up a lot and all that stuff too, you had very little to relate to with these kinds of super badass, tough guy bullshit superheroes. I was probably maybe in 6th or 7th grade when I first discovered the Marvel Essentials. These were black and white reprints of old Marvel comics. They were just printed out on cheap newsprint, but you would get 20 issues inside of a single book for a relatively good price. And it was around this time when I first picked up The Amazing Spider-Man, the 1960s title, which was co-created by Steve Ditko and Stan Lee. It had a massive effect on me. I had always liked old comics and old movies and things like that too, so this was definitely my flavor, even if a lot of other kids at school couldn't have cared less about old comics. But it was more than just the fact that it was old. It was something that I really just fell in love with and completely fell into the world of Spider-Man. First of all, was just the fact that, I could relate to Peter Parker. He had good intentions, he was a smart kid, he worked hard, but it was also just kind of a sad, lonely world where he tried his hardest to make friends, and he tried his hardest to have a loving relationship, just have a family to rely on, but he very rarely got any of that. The kids at school really didn't care for him, and of course his family was just his Aunt May, who he constantly had to take care of when she was having her own problems. And of course that was very relatable for me. There was not a lot of comic book creators, either back in the 60s or especially in the 90s, who would have had the guts to have had such a heartfelt character who struggled so much and yet was so alone and isolated from the world, but still kept up a lot of optimism. Just as much as Spider-Man appealed to me, there were the villains. Now, the villains were not seen in such a sympathetic light. In fact, there really wasn't any moment at all where a lot of the villains during this run showed human emotions or were sympathetic in the least. In fact, the more Steve Ditko got involved with the teachings of Ayn Rand, possibly Ditko thought that supervillains were glorifying crime. That's why a lot of the villains he would have in the later Spider-Man run, and especially in his own series afterwards, were more like gangsters and crooked politicians and embezzlers, things like that, rather than the likes of Dr. Octopus or the Green Goblin. But they were still extremely imaginative. That's the thing, is these villains had such great designs. They were so much fun to look at and read and just follow along no matter what terrible things they were doing. And not surprisingly, nearly every single villain that Steve Ditko had basically designed, they're pretty much all still with us today. They've all been in the movies. They're all still used in the comic books year after year after year, and for no other reason than because they're the best. They're just fantastic characters, fantastic designs, and artists just keep on coming back to them. When I started doing my own comic book series Scapula, I was realizing that a lot of what Ditko and Lee had created and the dramatic aspects of it and these bizarre villains, basically a lot of the appeal of the villains I sort of combined with a lot of the struggles and humanity of Spider-Man to just sort of create this own weird brand of villains in my comics. There were times when I definitely was aping Ditko's artwork just because I couldn't help myself. It was so damn good, although it's a surprisingly hard style to imitate, as a lot of people have tried. It's easy to parody, but understanding it is very, very difficult, and I can only hope I sort of scratched the surface of it. More than anyone else, Steve Ditko and Stan Lee probably had the biggest impact on the way I tell comic book stories, the way I craft my characters, and of course, the 15 years worth of Scapula Comics owes a humongous debt of inspiration. I can only hope that Ditko's world means as much to other comic creators now as it did for decades, and I can only hope that maybe we can inspire others just as much as our favorite creators have inspired us. Thank you, guys.